to Adjunemonkomo engages in conversations about mental health and neurodevelopmental conditions among our Ghanaian society. Recently, we've been talking about autism, the kind that our community we often misses. Our current episode, we had the privilege to talk to Emma Woodhouse. Emma Woodhouse is the co-founder for Compass Psychology Services. Compass Psychology Services train clinicians on how to use the autism diagnostic tools when making diagnostic decisions. Emma has quite a good experience and expertise when it comes to autism and ADHD as well. She has actually done some projects in Ghana and has a really good extensive knowledge. So it was really good opportunity to get some of Emma's insight when it comes to autism. Full episode can be found on our YouTube and Spotify channels. We also have bits and bobs on all other social media platforms, Facebook, TikTok, and other platforms. I'll say, people, this is a really, really good opportunity to actually learn more about autism traits, understand some of the practical sort of presentation when it comes to autism among our children and also us as adults. And thank you for watching, and please do put any comment, or if you've got any questions, any ideas, anything you would like to share, please put it in the comment sections and we will get back to you on that. Once again, thank you so much, Emma, for joining us. Emma Woodhouse is the co-founder Compass Psychology Service Limited, where most of individuals who have done a lot of training when it comes to autism, Emma has been quite helpful to give us some really good education and insight. And I will let Emma actually introduce herself, because there is quite a lot of things that she will say, particularly some work she has done in Ghana. So Emma, over to you.
Thank you very much. And it's a real pleasure to be here. So thank you for inviting me. My name is Emma Woodhouse, and I am co-director of Compass Psychology with Dr. Jack Hoddingdale. Over the past 20 years, I've worked in autism and also ADHD. And I've worked in research and clinical settings across the lifespan, so with very young children all the way through to older adults. And I've worked with a range of complexities as well with autism. I also am very fortunate that I've been able to do some work internationally, which has been a really valuable experience and hopefully helpful for the training that I've done in different parts of the world. And as you mentioned, that has included Ghana, which I absolutely loved, where myself and my co-director, Dr. Hoddingdale, did some work supporting the development of an autism school in Ghana, which was really wonderful, and met lots of very passionate people out there as well.
Thank you for that. And Emma has been quite kind to involve in our conversations when it comes to autism, the kind that we often misses in our community. So today is just going to be a free flow for Emma to actually give us some understanding of what autism is, and particularly in practical sense, what as a family and individuals, what we are to look out for, particularly around our children. So Emma, we want to know about, in a simple term, what would you explain autism as to someone who has never heard of it before?
It's a very good question. It's a good starting point, I think. So in terms of how we describe autism, it's often referred to a neurodevelopmental condition, which really just means it's about differences in the way that the brain develops. So it might be helpful also to say that it's not considered a mental health condition. It's sort of considered something that's neurodevelopmental. So it's there right from the beginning, although it may not always be identified until later on in life. And when we look at autism, we don't have like a brain scan or a blood test or a genetics test that we can do that tells us, yes, this person is autistic, or no, they're not. So what that means is that we have to do really comprehensive assessments with the person. And what we're looking for when we're doing those assessments is differences in the way people interact with others, in the way they communicate, in the way that they experience the social world and understand the social world. And that includes sort of peer relationships, friendships, understanding other people. And also we're interested in the presence of particular behaviours. So sometimes people might find very repetitive behaviours quite comforting, or they may get really, really, really lost in an intense interest so that it becomes sort of all-encompassing. Sometimes people might find it really difficult when things change. So little like minor changes in day-to-day life that most of us just kind of get on with actually might be really distressing in the context of autism. And also thinking about things like sensory processing. So people might have difficulties around sensory experiences. So one of the things that can make autism complicated is that it can look very different in different people. But fundamentally, we are looking at someone who has a collection of characteristics, which includes differences in social communication and the presence of some of these what we often call kind of repetitive behaviours or difficulties with flexibility or need for sameness and differences in sensory processing. For a diagnosis of autism, usually there does need to be evidence of what we call impairment, so that these characteristics that people experience lead to some kind of difficulties in day-to-day life. And that's why it's important to try and get a diagnosis so that we can understand the person's strengths, and there's often very many strengths, but also understand what might be difficult and make sure that people have the right support for the areas where they're struggling.
Thank you for that. And it was really good in terms of how you describe how autism can look like in different people. Really good, because I think in practice, what I normally comes across is whereby when social demand changes, we do see quite a lot of differences, particularly with girls, which autism may present differently to how it will shows in boys. But Emma, it's just I just want to find out from yourself in terms of some common misconceptions about autism. Do you get any sort of misconceptions in your role, particularly the work that you've done and training? Have you come across any sort of misconceptions about people's perceptions about autism?
Gosh, lots, yes. Lots of different misconceptions. And I think that's partly because actually autism can be really complicated. There are lots of misconceptions around sort of the reasons why people might be autistic. So we do know that there is a strong genetic component, and there's been lots of research around that. But people often think, well, if it's about genetics, then it must be that one person has passed it on in terms of like one of the parents, or it's come from one side of the family. But actually, in terms of the genes involved in autism, there's still quite a lot that we don't know. So it's not the case that there's just one gene that's passed on. So some of the reasons might be linked to genetics, but they're quite complicated and not always as straightforward as saying, well, they've got it from this side of the family or from this person. So one of the big misconceptions is understanding about why people are autistic. And part of the reason why there's some misconceptions is that we do know, there's quite a lot we know. We know it's very strongly genetic, but there's still a lot of questions around other factors that might influence that. So there's still a lot of ongoing research about that. But one of the main things to say is that it is a genetic condition, but there are multiple genes involved in it. And so that's one of the things that people might be unsure about. You know, it's certainly not caused by things like parenting, or it's not caused, people might have other theories around why people might be autistic, around, eating certain foods, that sort of thing. But what we do know from lots of research is that it's a strongly genetic condition.
Thank you. That is really helpful.
Thinking about, there's quite a lot of other misconceptions. I think that's one of the main ones. Also, I think probably one of the tricky things about assessing autism is that there is not a single behaviour on its own that if we see it, we can say, right, we've seen that person must be autistic. And there's not a single individual behaviour or characteristic that we can see and we can say, right, we've seen that, they can't be autistic. So when we do assessments, actually, one of the things that's really important is that we do a really detailed assessment and that we get a really good understanding about the presence of those different characteristics, what they look like in the person, whether we see them in different contexts, whether there might be other explanations as to why we're seeing those behaviours. So there aren't any sort of shortcuts and quick ways to do a good for autism. because we always have to think about the big picture and make sense of those things.
Yeah, thank you for that. And that was the question that I was going to ask, that I know we've talked about autism actually affects in terms of individuals' communication, interaction, some repetitive behaviors, but I was trying to find out in the simplest way and in practical way, what are we looking for when it comes to, for example, their communication style, if it's being affected, or their interaction style, if it's being affected? What are parents supposed to look out for so that they know this is being affected?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I suppose it's important to say from the outset that some of the behaviours that we might be interested in, you actually might see in the general population. So what I don't want to do is describe some behaviours and then for parents to think, oh, well, my child's done that, so that might mean they're autistic. Because there are kind of indicators that we might be interested in. But obviously, if we identify those, that doesn't automatically mean they're autistic. It just means, let's understand a bit more and let's, go into a bit more detail. I suppose there's two different ways to think about what we might look out for. One is about the presence of perhaps more unusual behaviours. So you might see, for example, some children doing things like really complicated body movements, so like spinning and repeatedly bouncing up and down. And the movements might be quite complicated. And sometimes they're called like body mannerisms. Now, that's not the same as a child who's running around because they've got lots of energy. It's quite a kind of specific behaviour that we might look out for. So some of the behaviours we're interested in might be what we think about as the kind of the presence of more unusual behaviours. So that's one example. Or sort of really completely engrossed in a particular interest that becomes all-encompassing, not just like a hobby that they, perhaps just like, but often with the very intense interest, it might become all-consuming and may kind of prevent them from doing other things. So there's some behaviours we'll look out for the presence of those being a bit unusual. But equally, we're also interested in the absence of expected behaviours. So what we know about child development, and there's lots and lots of research about what we expect to see at certain ages in children. And of course, some of those things are more universal. Some of them might be more culturally specific. But certainly we would expect, even in very young children, in the first 3-4 years of life, you might expect young children to have an interest in other people around them. Might be smiling at parents or family members who are familiar to them. They might be interested in watching other children around them. They might be, when they're excited about something, they might be wanting to draw their parents' attention or family members' attention to something they're enjoying or they're interested in. So there are certain behaviours that we know that lots of children are likely to engage in. And that's also when they're learning to communicate, even before children learn to use words and language. You might expect to hear babbling, and they may use babbling to get their parents' attention or to direct or express something. They might use gestures like pointing to show that they want. They might look at the parent and then look at what they want. So we're looking at these combination of verbal and non-verbal behaviours, social behaviours and those sorts of things. And if those things are missing and you're not seeing those sorts of behaviours, that's also very relevant and important as well. So there's some things that we are thinking about and looking at that you might see, okay, we're seeing this behaviour and it's a little bit unexpected in that not that many children in the general population will do that. And there are other behaviours where you think, well, we would expect to see some of these social communicative behaviours, but they don't seem to be there. Now, that doesn't automatically mean that the person is autistic. Okay, there's lots of reasons why we might see certain behaviours or not see other behaviours that aren't to do with autism. So when we do an assessment, we would notice those things, but we would do a really kind of in-depth assessment, which would also involve thinking, are there other explanations for this? So that might be, I don't know, if you've got a child who has difficulties with hearing, they may not be responding to you because they can't hear. So obviously you need to rule out certain things and think about, okay, are there other explanations before you would just say, okay, this must be autism.
Yeah. Thank you for that. That is, that explains a lot in terms of us parents, what are some of the things that to look out for. But again, like you said, there isn't such a broad sort of, not just because they are presenting with such a symptoms means they are autistic. So there is a lot more that needs to be done before a final diagnosis is agreed. Another thing that I wanted myself to us is about masking behaviors when it comes to autism, which we do hear quite a lot. And what I want to find out, can you explain what masking is in its simplest form for us?
Yeah, so there's been quite a lot of kind of research and conversations around things like masking and camouflaging. And really, the kind of broader category is often referred to as camouflaging behaviours. And essentially, camouflaging refers to kind of strategies that people might be engaging in that to either hide certain behaviours that might be associated with autism or to mimic behaviours that are more like their peers who aren't autistic. So there's different strategies and different ways in which people might camouflage and different reasons why they might do that. So it can be things like copying other people's body language or trying to learn about social cues and understand about things like friendships by watching films or looking at books or trying to really study those things because it doesn't necessarily feel intuitive to some people. It might also be masking often talks about trying to hide characteristics or so kind of adjusting people's nonverbal communication and to try and appear more confident or forcing eye contact when it's, not comfortable for the person. So sometimes these are the different behaviours that different people might engage in to sort of appear to be non-autistic. So it's really important to have an understanding of this. But it's also important to point out that these behaviours that we're talking about, which is to perhaps hide some behaviours and then learn to use other behaviours, that's not specific to autism. Okay? So, in day-to-day life, we might kind of actively hide certain behaviours in certain contexts. We might try to present in a particular way in another context. And the other thing is you can also see these sorts of behaviours in the context of things like ADHD or depression or anxiety. So it's really important to be aware that these people might be using these strategies in the context of autism. But if we are thinking about that clinically and we're doing an assessment, we have to be really, really clear about how is that person camouflaging? What strategies are they using? Are those strategies in line with what we'd expect at that developmental stage? So if someone says, my 18-month-old is camouflaging, you might think, well, that doesn't necessarily fit with what you'd expect for developmental expectations. And to think about whether that seems to have a clinical quality and the sort of whether people are using the types of strategies that you might see in autism. So sometimes it helps us to understand why, children might seem to be getting on okay at school, but when they get home, everything falls apart because they've been working so hard all day at school to appear as though they're not autistic, either by hiding certain natural behaviours that are quite natural and perhaps comforting for them, but trying to hide them so people don't notice them, or trying to pretend that they are presenting in a way that's sort of non-autistic. And if you do that all day, it can be really tiring and really exhausting. So it's one of the things that might explain why there is a difference between how people seem to be at school versus how they are at home, for example. However, we have to make sure as clinicians that we are really, really careful with how we understand that. We don't just say, it's not the same, must be camouflaging or masking. We have to really make sure that we assess that and to make sure it makes sense as an explanation as to why we're seeing different things in different contexts. And that's the job of the clinician to make sense of that.
Yeah. And do we see a lot of masking in females compared to males, or it can be anyone?
It can be anyone. So actually, I've worked with people of all genders who engage in these strategies. And part of my work is to work therapeutically. And I've worked with males who have engaged with really, really extensive camouflaging strategies, like mapping out conversations, practicing in the mirror, so practicing facial expressions, trying to learn how to vary intonation, even filming themselves to watch back, those sorts of things. So often people talk about camouflaging in relation to females, but actually I think it's important to recognise that people of any gender may be engaging in these behaviours as well.
Thank you for that. And Emma, we've been talking more recently autism, how it looks like in our community, particularly Ghanaian community. And in fact, recently I did some one of my short podcast presentation. I did ask a question, and the question was to find out people's understanding of what autism was, but I think I made it a little bit difficult in terms of I wanted people to explain in one word where people did came up with some really good words, which was really interesting.
I'd be really interested to hear about that.
Yes, what actually became apparent was the differences in culture when it comes to autism and people's background and their understanding of it. And there are a lot of myths, particularly regarding autism. And I think earlier on you did explain in terms of the causes of autism, but yet there are still myths around autism. So in your experience, working with families from different backgrounds, how can cultural expectations influence how autism is understood?
It's a really interesting question. I think the first thing to say actually is that there are different parts of the world where we have quite a lot of research around autism and what how that might present in different sociocultural contexts. And there are parts of the world where we actually know very little. And the reason for that might be because there isn't kind of the infrastructure that's needed for research. There aren't the academic institutions and the funding that are needed to carry out the research that basically tells us more about these things. So I can certainly share from some of the experiences of doing international training in different parts of the world, but some of that might be more based on kind of my experiences of meeting people, conversations with people. And obviously just visiting for a month or two is not the same as being, really immersed in a different culture and having an in-depth understanding of that. But I suppose there's a starting point is around the kind of awareness and recognition on what people, just in the general public understand around autism. So one thing that I've found in different parts of the world is that perhaps people might have quite a specific idea of what autism looks like. So that might be, I think that autistic people or children may not have any language, or they might struggle academically, so they can't read or can't write or don't have language. Or they might have an idea of autism that's very, very specific, whereas actually autism is very, very broad. So some of my work in different parts of the world, people have been very surprised when they've realised that lots and lots of autistic young people and adults may be verbally fluent, go to university, do a degree, have a job, have a family. I'm quite surprised about that because perhaps their idea of what autism looks like is more where you have autism plus something like learning disability and intellectual disability. So they may be thinking of a very specific presentation of autism rather than knowing that it's very, very varied. So that's one of the considerations around people being aware of what autism can look like. Sometimes there might be an idea that behaviours that are actually associated with something else, so things like ADHD, in some parts of the world where I've worked, where actually there's lots of really, really significant hyperactivity, people have thought, that's because of autism, and actually the person is autistic and they also have ADHD. So sometimes there's a confusion around, okay, what might be related to autism and what might be other things as well. So there's a question around sort of awareness and understanding and accessing services, but then also about clinicians, what they understand about kind of different presentations in different sociocultural contexts. Now, the core characteristics of autism, fundamentally, are very similar across, from what we know from the research, that you see the core diagnostic characteristics. I did some work a few years ago with a hunter-gatherer tribe in Tanzania. So I lived alongside a nomadic hunter-gatherer tribe looking at psychiatric difficulties in children and young people, obviously through research through King's College London. And actually, even in that very, very different context, some of the core characteristics that we know are associated with autism really just looked the same. Now, that's not to say there aren't different considerations depending on the cultural context, because of course there are. So things like expectations around what might be considered socially inappropriate can be very different in different parts of the world. Expectations around social cues, around social rules, expectations around how people use eye contact, use of eye gaze with people in authority, people of different gender, those sorts of things. Gestures, by their very nature, conventional gestures, can be culturally specific. So certain gestures that we use have a specific meaning based on the cultural context. So there's certainly differences around, considerations that we might be looking at, and also biases that clinicians might have based on their own cultural
Mm.
background and perceiving it through that lens rather than having an understanding of those kind of differences. So I think some of the core characteristics that define autism as a condition, you might expect to look quite similar across the board, but there will be differences in how things are, perhaps how they manifest in different contexts based on things like expectations and understanding the nuances around social communication, particularly in different parts of the world.
Which is something that, because I mean, growing up in Ghana, when it comes to socially communicating, I think in our Ghanaian culture, respect is really important. And particularly when you are talking to an adult, you would be expected times not to look at them in the eye, because that is actually classified as rude. But as we are currently evolving around things, that seems to be not so much the case. But culturally, there are quite a lot of things that in our homes at the moment, it is culturally accepted, but then it may not be. And that's what you said earlier, that it depends. It depends on cultural context when it comes to some of the behaviors, and particularly eye contact and gestures are really important. And in terms of advice, what advice will you give to any of the parents who will feel quite hesitant about seeking assessment due to stigma? Because in our community, stigma and fear of being judged around having a child or even an individual with autistic traits really impact and influence parents' decisions in terms of wanting to seek support. Have you got any advice for parents to have the right support, to seek support?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question, because I think it's essential that we don't underestimate the significance of some of these barriers. Things around stigma, for example, that might prevent people from seeking help, because they're very, they can be very sort of significant considerations, whether that's stigma kind of within, from other family members or from the community more broadly. It's important to kind of recognise that they can be very real barriers for many people. It's very easy to say, it's important to go and seek help because it can enable your child to get the right support. But actually, recognising the significance of those barriers, I think, is really important. So I suppose what I would say is to think about, in seeking support for your child is going to be exactly the same. Wonderful child before a diagnosis, after a diagnosis. And going for a diagnostic assessment has no bearing on changing who they are as a person. All the things you absolutely love about them will be the same, whether they have a diagnosis or not. All the things that might frustrate you, which, everybody has things that are frustrating, will be the same. They are exactly the same person, the day before they might go for assessment and not have an autism diagnosis. And if they do go through that assessment and get a diagnosis, they're exactly the same wonderful person before and afterwards. But what an assessment can do is to help to understand more about their strengths. And there's very often many strengths associated with autism, but also to have a really good understanding of where they may be struggling and what support they might need. And the earlier we have an understanding of that, the more we can put in place to make sure that they get the support they need. Now, it's not always as straightforward, unfortunately, in that if you get a diagnosis, that automatically leads to people getting the help they need. But it's certainly a starting point. So it gives us a place to sort of start with having more understanding of what they're good at, what they enjoy, what their strengths are, but also what's difficult for them. And the more we know, the stronger position we're in to be able to provide that support. The difficulty with not seeking support might be that if a child is autistic and it's not identified, they may not get the support they need, and they may end up thinking, oh, there's something wrong with me, rather than actually the way my brain works is a bit different, the way I experience the world is a bit different. I'm really good at these things. I really struggle with these things. Everybody has that. But if that's not recognised and they don't have the right support, it can have quite an impact on them in terms of not getting the help they need, but also quite an impact on their sense of self and their confidence and, self-esteem as well. The other thing to say is, if you do go through the assessment process and your child does get a diagnosis, then it might be thinking about that can take a while to get your head around, as a family. And it may take a bit of time before you think about who am I going to share this information with. It might be that you just start to make sense of it, in the immediate family first of all, perhaps share the information with school if that's helpful. But perhaps it might take a while to think about who am I going to share this information with? And when do we want to share that information, when is right, in a way that makes sense. So sometimes, taking a bit of time to work out how that would work best can be helpful as well. The other thing is that ruling out autism can also be very helpful, because if there are someone's experiencing some difficulties and someone thinks, well, this could be autism, actually it's very, very helpful to have the assessment. And if they're not autistic, to have that ruled out, because that might say, okay, we need to look at some other things. So the more we know, the more we can support the child, really.
Thank you for that. And myself, Emma, I do a lot of these diagnostic, and I have done a lot more feedbacks where I've fed back to parents, and it's about sometimes parents are quite relieved because they feel their children, they will be able to understand themselves, and so well other people understand themselves. Understand them. And I've had instances where I have been able to explain to the children in terms of autism, yes, it affects the way that individuals think, but then what I learn is about individuals with autism actually think outside the box. So that's what we look at it. They ask the questions why, so they don't just do things for just doing things, but they want to know a reason to every sort of thing that has been asked. And that is really important. Like Emma said, when we sort out that assessment and see what has been going on, we seek the strength. And by seeking the strength, it means that we are going to identify them, and then we can channel our children's sort of strength into quite a positive things for future. And we do know quite a lot of individuals who are have diagnosis of autism, but then they are doing quite well. I think, Emma, it's something that it will be quite good for parents to know these things, because autism actually it doesn't define who the person is. It's actually focusing on strength and putting. Once we know what it is for now, then we put the right support in place for our children to have a better life for the future. That was really helpful. I remember, in fact, before I even asked you, I remember at some point I done speaking to someone who shared a very interesting story where there was a child who was playing with cars for quite a lot of the time, and it's quite an intense interest. But then once the parents had identified that and there was an assessment that was done, they were able to support the child in that. The child grew up to work in one of the top car industries, and is really very productive in terms of what they are doing. So I think seeking an assessment doesn't mean your child is autistic, but then again, if there is, then the right support will be put in place. Thank you. Thank
Absolutely.
you so much for that. And Emma, I just wanted to ask from you, if a parent is listening to us and they feel a bit overwhelmed, what are some of the steps they, with at home? What can they do in terms of if they feel a child is struggling with autism, or even if there is a diagnosis and they are struggling in terms of managing? Is there anything you feel they can do at home?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I suppose partly it might depend on the age and developmental stage of the child. So we might have people listening who have much younger children who have no language at this stage. And we might have listeners who have teenagers who are verbally fluent. So partly it might depend on the age and stage of the child, and again, what are their strengths and what they're struggling with. One thing I would always talk about is connection, and actually I think this applies to everybody, whether autistic or not. But it's around finding a way to connect with your child in a way that kind of works. So sometimes the way that we might try to connect with other people might be based on what we know. If if we're trying to connect, for example, by asking questions verbally, asking questions, whether it's what did you do at school today, and the child is not really giving very much back because they're really exhausted, and actually their favourite way to communicate is not verbally. We have to think about, are we trying to connect with the child or whoever it might be in a way that kind of works? So partly it's thinking about choosing your moments, because if you have a child who really, really struggles at school and they've had an exhausting day trying to manage all of the demands of school, with all the busyness, the social demands, the sensory demands, executive functioning, like planning, work, academic demands, and the time that you try to connect with them is when you see them at the end of the school day, that actually might be the most difficult time for them to connect with you. Because at that point, they may need space, they may need to decompress, they may need to just not think, not have to talk. So that might not be the best time for some children. For other children, it might be when they really want to tell you things. It kind of depends on the individual. The other thing about thinking about connecting is that sometimes it can be frustrating for parents if they are trying to understand behaviours and they might be asking their child verbally, why did you do this? Or, why didn't you do this? And sometimes the child may not know, or they may find it difficult to put into words, find it hard to communicate those things. And then if they say something like, I don't know, or they don't answer, or they don't give a response, the parent can think, oh, well, that's frustrating because I'm trying to understand. And sometimes where things become more difficult is because that, connection is not happening in the right way or at the right time. The other thing is that if a child is feeling very distressed, so if they're very overwhelmed or they're upset or they're anxious or they're angry, they'll be very kind of physiologically aroused. So it's very difficult for anybody to kind of think straight, to kind of have conversations, to think through rationally when you're kind of very, in a high state of emotional arousal. So in those moments, if your child is overwhelmed or distressed, in the moment, it's just about making them kind of feel calm, obviously safe, so that there's nothing that might lead them to harm themselves, like hitting their heads, that sort of thing. But actually that the environment is as calming as possible in those moments when they're very overwhelmed. Because at that moment, it's not the best, absolutely. It's probably the worst time to try and sort of reason or explain or, talk things through, because they're not in a place where they can process that or communicate. So in those moments, it's about making the child feel safe and calm, and then to explore things when they're feeling calmer. And often connection might be around more things like, rather than purely relying on verbal interaction, it might be while you're doing something together, playing a game, or looking at a book, or going for a walk. So it's not just all about the verbal communication. Or it might be choose a song that shows how you feel at the moment, or draw a picture. So very often as adults, I think we kind of over-rely on verbal interaction. And for many children, actually, that can be the most difficult way to communicate and connect. So it's just trying different things, thinking about the timing, and the stronger connection you're able to build in those moments, it's from there where you can usually kind of offer more support.
Thank you for that. And it leads to, in terms of sensory differences when it comes to autism, there are a lot. And again, you've explained previously that some sensory there isn't, just because individuals are presenting in such a way means they have got autism. But when it comes to sensory differences, can you explain a bit to us in terms of, as a parents, what are some of the sensory differences that an individual with autism may present?
Yeah, it's also a bit complicated with, it can be complicated with sensory processing, because obviously we all experience the world through our senses. So if I was to ask everybody, can you tell me one thing you either like or dislike in relation to sensory processing? Most people, or almost everybody, if not everybody, can say there's one thing that I like the smell of a certain candle, or I don't like, the feel of a certain material against my skin. Most people will have at least one thing that they like or dislike. So when we are thinking about clinical assessment, there's similar with things like routine. Lots of people have a routine and they like a routine, but we're not coding sort of preferences and dislikes when it comes to the diagnostic assessment. We're coding when things sort of go up to a different level. So with things like routine, lots of people have a routine, but if someone was to say, oh, do you mind if I pop into the bathroom before you, because I've got to leave, and you just have breakfast first, most people will be able to tolerate a minor change like that to their daily routine without it causing distress. So with things like routines, we're looking at more significant distress associated with small changes. And similarly with sensory processing, we're not just thinking about, or likes and dislikes, or they, might not want to eat particular foods sometimes, or not like, things like cutting a scratchy label out of some clothing. Lots of people would do that. We really think about when does it sort of become more noticeable, more part of day-to-day life? When does it cause kind of difficulties or impairment or distress? Because when it starts to have such an impact on daily life, that's when it becomes kind of something that we think about in more clinical terms. So if your child says, I don't like scratchy wool against their skin, that doesn't necessarily mean it's an indicator of, clinically significant autism-related sensory processing difficulties. But if it's something that's coming up on a more regular basis and it's causing impairment, then we would certainly explore that and think about how that might be impacting daily life and how we might support with that. Because it can be seeking behaviours, it can be aversions to things, it can be general sensitivity. And obviously, it can have a huge impact because we experience everything through our senses. So when those things become distressing, it can have a huge, huge impact on the young person and adults as well, of course.
Thank you for that, Emma. This has been really helpful. It has been really helpful. And I think as parents as well, there is quite a lot we have to do in order to support our children. And that is working with other professionals, working with school to actually make sure that whatever we are seeing at home is also being told at home. And what I have come across normally, that is, within our community, I've heard some people say that, well, when they've gone to school, teachers have said certain things which at home hasn't been present at home. Again, the vice versa, where parents have said things at home which hasn't shown in school. So working with teachers, working with other professionals in terms of knowing some of the traits is really important. In your view, how do you think as parents we can build effective relationship with schools that our children goes to?
Yeah, it's a big question and it's a really important one again, I think. Some people report having very, very strong supportive relationships with school and with staff, and obviously for other people it can be really, really difficult. I think one of the key things is around communication, and obviously there might be different challenges in perhaps a smaller primary school versus in secondary school when you've got lots and lots of different teachers, lots of subjects. But I think whatever stage they're at in terms of education, that the communication is really important. One thing that I have noticed sometimes is that the communication might be a little bit vague in terms of describing very general behaviours. But what can be more helpful is if you're trying to sort of get information from school is to try and get them to really give specific examples of what they mean. Otherwise, sometimes parents and teaching staff are communicating about different things, and it's really trying to make sure that the communication happens like this. And that requires the communication from both sides. And I suppose that's one of the key things, thinking about understanding, what those needs might be. So I just spoke to someone today who was saying, they were concerned about social relationships, but it was quite a kind of vague thing. It didn't really say what the concerns were. Are you talking about peer relationships? Do we think this is are they behaving in a way that's inappropriate, upsetting other children, perhaps unintentionally? Is it that they are struggling with flexibility? So in play, perhaps the other children are thinking, I might go and play with someone else because I'd like to bring in my ideas, and that's difficult for the person. Is it to do with them not going out because they feel anxious? So when you've got a really broad statement like, difficulties socially, that doesn't really tell us very much at all. You've got to try and make sense of what might be going on. And that's hard sometimes. It's hard for parents to know what might be underlying that. It might be hard from teachers to know from, trying to pick up on those things when there's lots of children in one class. So I think the communication is really key, but it can be tricky. Schools can be a school environment can be very, very demanding, particularly for somebody who finds social communication, who has differences in social communication, who has differences in terms of sensory processing, who finds change difficult. So if those things aren't kind of managed in that environment, then the school environment can in some situations be quite overwhelming. The flip side is, of course, that there can be some changes that can make quite a big difference.
Yes, yeah. Yeah. And if any parents is listening, particularly within the UK here, what should the parents do in terms of if they want to seek an assessment for their children? What is the process to go through?
Yeah, actually, one thing I meant to say a bit earlier on was around the age at which children might be assessed for autism. Although we're looking at, as we said, it's a kind of neurodevelopmental condition, so it will really be there from the beginning. In the UK, people won't give a diagnosis of autism until sort of usually around 2.5, 3, that sort of age onwards. And of course, some people might not get a diagnosis until adulthood because it's just not picked up. And part of the reason for that is because in those early years, children develop at different rates. Sometimes children hit milestones at different ages. They might learn about things like play and communication at different rates. Because that can vary quite a lot in the first 2-3 years of life. Sometimes if people are looking for potential assessment very early on, advice might be, sometimes they might say, look, between 2 and 3, we can be reasonably confident that they do or do not meet the criteria. Other times they might say, look, we need to kind of just wait and do what people refer to as kind of watchful waiting, see how they get on as they spend more time in nursery and reception, that sort of thing. I suppose it depends in terms of seeking assessment. If it's in the early years, that might be something that the health visitor might pick up sometimes. But the first port of call would usually be the GP, or to discuss that with the school, because there are different kind of referral processes in different parts of the country in the UK. But certainly it would be something to raise with the GP in the first instance, and to see, in terms of the school and whether they have any particular referral processes there. It might also depend on whether they're involved in other services as well. So, for example, if you have a child who's got delayed speech, that doesn't mean that the child's automatically autistic, but they may be having support for speech and language development, or they may be having support for something else. So if they're already involved in a service for another reason, it might be worth thinking about talking to those professionals to see whether they have any sort of suggestions around the referral process as well. But usually GP would be GP, other kind of health services if they're already involved in those, and then potentially school as well.
And how does the assessment process look like if someone were to go through?
It varies. It can vary. Really, there should be a detailed parent interview that asks lots of questions about early development. So even if you're, say you've got your child is 16 years old, part of the interview will involve speaking to the parent about how they were when they were younger in those early years. Sometimes parents worry, I won't remember the details, I can't remember specific information, and that's absolutely fine. With it's clinicians doing the assessments. We're very used to parents saying, I can't remember that. So part of our job is to think about how to prepare you for that interview. So we would ask about things like language development, so interest in peers, ask about play, any difficulties with minor changes to routine, any repetitive behaviours, any sensory differences. So we do a really, really in-depth interview around the early years, as well as asking about what's happening now. We're not asking about the early years because we think it's something to do with, parenting, and that's why somebody might be having difficulties. The reason we ask about the early years is because autism would be present. You expect to see some differences, at least differences in the early years, even if they don't cause impairment till later. It should also involve a direct assessment with the child themselves, and we have different versions of the assessment based on their language levels. So we still can assess children who perhaps aren't using any language yet, and it might be more a play-based assessment, all the way through to assessing, verbally fluent teenagers and adults. So you select the version of the direct assessment based on things like, what their language is like and how old they are. And usually for children, lots of children quite enjoy that because it's often play-based with toys and things. So sometimes children quite enjoy it. Not always, but they do sometimes. One thing that's incredibly important is that the assessment for autism also considers information from school and considers whether there might be other explanations for what we're seeing. So just to give you one very quick example, one thing that people often focus on, but a kind of obvious example, is differences in eye contact. Okay, so that might be related to autism, but it could also be related to ADHD because somebody's very distracted, so they're looking around. It could be to do with potentially something like psychosis, because people might be having hallucinations and responding to those. It could be to do with anxiety, because people are feeling very self-conscious and they don't feel comfortable making eye contact. It could be to do with depression. It could be to do with kind of cultural differences. You're thinking about, as you mentioned earlier, kind of direct gaze with people in authority. It could just be because some people don't like making eye contact and it's not to do with any condition. So we cannot just look for things that could be autism. We have to also think, could there be other explanations for this? And that's a really, really important part of the process. Because if we don't do that, we could end up giving the wrong diagnosis and misdirecting people away from the help they need.
Thank you for that, Emma. And just the last question to find out from yourself, in terms of the services that you provide in terms of education and the training, is there like a training for families to understand autism, or even post-diagnostic sort of services? Is there anything, do you do anything like?
In terms of the training at Compass, we offer assessments for children and adults, but most of the training that we offer is more for professionals. However, there's actually a lot of really good free talks out there. So things like ACAM, and I can send you some of these links. I've got some really, really helpful talks that relate to different kind of considerations in autism. So they've got things like autism and sleep, which can be a difficulty for some people. Autism and kind of eating and diet, which can be a concern for some people. Things like autism and sensory overwhelm and anxiety. So there's a series of talks. There's lots out there, but ACAM are one of the ones that offer some really good free talks that are kind of aimed to parents and families that you can kind of listen to based on whatever area of interest or area of concern that you might have. And that might all be different for different people. So for some people, it might be more around sensory things. Some people, it might be more about self-injurious behaviour. For some people, it might be around, eating or sleep. So there's lots of different ones. So I can certainly point you in the direction of some of those, because I think they could be really helpful resources for families.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Emma, for taking time today to actually explain autism.
Pleasure.
And how practical it can look like, and some support for both family and children. It has been really helpful. I do know there is a lot of individuals, clinicians who are currently doing courses, and Emma Compass actually do autism, both developmental, ADIR, and ADOS training. Emma, thank you so much. Is there anything that you want to add to it, or?
No, just to say thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I have worked with autism for about 20 years. I absolutely love it. I feel very privileged to have worked with lots and lots of different families in different parts of the world. And it's a real honour and privilege to do so, to learn from everybody. And just to say thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.